October 1918, the Argonne Forest. Fog thick as smoke clings to the ravaged hills. The trees are split by shellfire, the earth black with blood and rain. From the mist, you can hear it. The fading echo of gunfire, the whistle of artillery, and the low, stubborn heartbeat of men who refuse to die quietly. They called them the Lost Battalion. Nearly 600 American soldiers from the 77th Division, cut off behind German lines. No food, no water, no communication. Hemmed in by the enemy, bombed by their own artillery, and left to fend for survival in a pit of mud and madness. At their center stood Major Charles Whittlesey, a quiet New York lawyer turned reluctant commander, now facing an impossible choice: surrender his men or hold the line against the weight of the entire German army. And in that place of shadows, with death circling like wolves, a single carrier pigeon would become their only voice and their final hope. This is the story of the Lost Battalion, the men who were trapped, bombed by their own guns, and still refused to give up. By the autumn of 1918, the First World War was a dying beast, thrashing in its final convulsions. The Western Front had been locked in mud and murder for 4 years, but now, at last, the Allies were pushing. America had joined the war late, yet with fresh soldiers and fierce optimism, they were determined to break the German line once and for all. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was to be the hammer blow, a coordinated assault through the forested hills of northeastern France. The 77th Division, made up of mostly working-class New Yorkers, dockworkers, barbers, immigrants who spoke a dozen languages but shared one uniform, was ordered to advance through a stretch of wilderness so dense and tangled it seemed designed by nature to trap armies. Their commander, Major Charles Whittlesey, wasn't a soldier by birth. He was a Manhattan lawyer, quiet, cerebral, the kind of man who measured his words before speaking them. Yet here he was, leading hundreds of men through the hellish labyrinth of the Argonne, where every tree could hide a sniper and every ravine could be a grave. The plan was simple, too simple. Whittlesey's battalion would push deep into enemy lines, while the French and other American units advanced on either side, creating a sweeping front. But the forest swallowed radio signals, and the maps were wrong. Soon, Whittlesey's men, 500 strong, had marched so far forward that they were no longer the tip of the spear. They were the spear itself, driven deep and abandoned. And when the German guns opened fire behind them, the men realized the truth. They were no longer advancing. They were surrounded. In the half-light of the Argonne, Major Charles Whittlesey stood in a gully carved by weeks of rain and war. His men crouched among splintered stumps and the ruins of trees that looked like broken bones. Their uniforms were soaked, their rifles slick with mud. Somewhere above them, German machine guns rattled like angry insects. Whittlesey unrolled his map, or what passed for one. It was smudged, outdated, almost useless. According to it, they weren't even where they stood. The coordinates made no sense. He knew then what no commander ever wants to admit. They were off the grid, cut loose from command, deep inside the German line with no support on either flank. But orders were orders. They had been told to hold this ground at all costs. Around him were men of every accent and borough, Italian immigrants from Brooklyn, Irish laborers from the Bronx, a Jewish tailor from the Lower East Side. Some had never left New York before they'd crossed the Atlantic. They called themselves the Liberty Division, but in that forest, liberty was a fading rumor. By the evening of October 2nd, the Germans had closed in on all sides. Runners sent back for help never returned. Telephone lines were shredded by shellfire. Ammunition was running low. Their field kitchens, their link to food and water, were gone. The only supplies they had were what they carried on their backs. Whittlesey gathered his officers in a crater half filled with rainwater. "We hold here," he said. His voice was steady, the tone of a man forcing logic into chaos. "We dig in. No retreat. No surrender." The men obeyed, clawing trenches out of the soaked earth with helmets and bayonets. The mud stank of rot and cordite. As night fell, the forest came alive with sound, the German shouts echoing through the mist, the metallic clink of rifles being loaded, the scream of shells overhead. At dawn, a courier stumbled in, face pale beneath his helmet. "Major," he gasped, "we're firing on our own position." Friendly artillery, their only hope of support, had mistaken their coordinates for those of the enemy. Explosions ripped through their lines. Men screamed. The ground shook. The sky turned red. Whittlesey's options narrowed to one: get word out. Somewhere behind the lines, their commanders needed to know where they were, or every shell would land on American flesh. But every runner sent out had been killed or captured. Every flare was useless under the canopy. Only one method remained, ancient, fragile, and desperate. Whittlesey turned to his signal officer. "Get the pigeons." A small wicker cage was carried forward, trembling with life. Inside, a handful of carrier pigeons, the last lifeline of the lost battalion. The men watched as Whittlesey pulled one bird out, grey feathers, wide eyes, and began to write a message on a small scrap of paper. "We are along the road parallel to 276. 4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on US. For heaven's sake, stop it." He rolled it, tied it to the bird's leg, and looked up at the sky choked with smoke. "Godspeed," he whispered. The pigeon launched into the chaos and vanished. That bird's name was Cher Ami, and before the week was over, she would become one of the most famous messengers in the history of war. The forest turned against them. For 5 endless days, Whittlesey's men fought not for victory, but for breath, every hour an act of defiance against annihilation. German forces pressed in from all sides, tightening the noose with machine gun fire and mortars that turned the forest floor into a cauldron. The air smelled of pine sap and death. Men crouched in shallow pits, firing blindly through the smoke, faces streaked with grime, lips cracked from thirst. The wounded moaned in the mud. Those still standing tore open their canteens for the last drops of brown, stagnant water. The living shared crumbs with the dying. They ate leaves, scraped bark, caught rainwater in helmets. The forest was a cathedral of suffering, its every echo a prayer for relief that never came. And above them, the artillery still fell, their own shells bursting in terrible rhythm. Each explosion tore through men they'd known since training. One soldier screamed into the fog, "They're killing us. Our own guns are killing us." Major Whittlesey didn't flinch. His voice stayed low, measured, almost eerily calm. He gathered the next pigeon, his hands trembling only slightly. The message was short, almost pitifully human. "Our artillery is still dropping short. For the love of God, stop it." He released it. The bird took flight, and a shell burst nearby, shredding branches and feathers. The men ducked instinctively. When they looked again, the pigeon was gone, carried off by the smoke. No one knew if it had made it. By the 3rd day, the Germans sent a messenger under a white flag. They offered Whittlesey terms: surrender, food, medical aid. He read the note in silence, then handed it back. "Go to hell," he said. That night, the forest roared again. Flares illuminated the twisted trees, revealing faces hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. The men fought off repeated German assaults, bayonet to bayonet, grenade to grenade, until their rifles were too hot to hold. Then, from somewhere in the pit, came the last pigeon, Cher Ami. Her left leg was splintered from a previous wound. The men watched as Whittlesey wrote a message, his last, if this failed. "We are along the road 276. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage. For heaven's sake, stop it." He tied the paper to her leg, kissed his hand, and released her. Cher Ami rose through the smoke, wings flashing silver for an instant, and then gunfire erupted. The Germans fired upward, 100 rifles crackling. The bird dipped, swerved, kept going. A bullet tore through her breast, another shattered her leg. Still she flew, 25 miles through wind, shrapnel, and death. Hours later, at an artillery command post far behind the front, a soldier saw a ragged shape collapse onto the table, feathers torn, blood on the message tube. They unwrapped the note with shaking hands. The coordinates were clear. Within minutes, the guns fell silent. In the forest, Whittlesey looked up to a sudden stillness. No more shells, just the ringing in his ears and the rasp of breathing around him. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to exhale. Cher Ami had made it. She'd lost an eye, her leg hung by a tendon, but she had lived, and with her, the lost battalion's hope. The men would still have to fight to survive, but now, at least, they would not die by their own hands. By the 5th day, the lost battalion was no longer a fighting unit. It was a collection of ghosts clinging to the idea of endurance. Out of nearly 550 men, fewer than 200 could still stand. Ammunition was nearly gone. The forest was so thick with corpses that new dead lay across the old. The wounded cried for water that didn't exist. Major Whittlesey hadn't slept in 3 days. His uniform hung in tatters, his eyes sunken, his voice a whisper of gravel. Yet when another German assault came roaring out of the mist, he climbed from his trench, pistol in hand, and shouted, "Hold your fire until you see them." The attack broke like a wave against rock. Every surviving rifle cracked once, twice, then again, and when the smoke cleared, the Germans withdrew. The men didn't cheer. They simply reloaded because they knew the next wave would come. Then the forest went quiet. No more artillery, no more shouting, just a strange, ringing stillness. Some thought it was the end. Others thought they'd gone deaf. But then, faintly, through the mist, came the sound of whistles and voices, American voices. A patrol from the 308th had broken through the German lines. When they stumbled into the hollow, they stopped dead in their tracks. Before them lay what was left of Whittlesey's command, gaunt figures staring from muddy holes, eyes hollow, uniforms shredded. One of the rescuers whispered, "Jesus Christ, they're still alive." Whittlesey stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud. He didn't salute, didn't smile. He just said, "You're late." Then he turned and sat down on a log, head in his hands, as the sound of sobbing filled the forest. When the survivors were led out, the ground behind them was littered with letters, helmets, and rifles. Fragments of men who had refused to surrender even when the world itself seemed to have abandoned them. Cher Ami, their broken savior, was awarded the French Croix de Guerre and stuffed for display at the Smithsonian. Whittlesey, silent and haunted, became a national hero, but he never escaped the forest. 3 years later, he boarded a ship and disappeared into the sea, leaving only a note behind. His men lived on, but every autumn, when the fog rolled through the Argonne, they said you could still hear the echo of his voice, the calm command in the chaos, and the faint flutter of wings rising through smoke. The rescue of the lost battalion rippled far beyond that blood-soaked forest. Newspapers back home turned their ordeal into legend, Americans who would not yield. Mothers framed their sons, names in gold, while schoolchildren memorized Whittlesey's defiance as proof of something elemental in the American spirit. But the truth, as always, was darker. When the survivors reached the rear lines, many couldn't speak. Some simply stared into space, others clawed at their food as if it might vanish. A few went mad on the spot, calling out for comrades who had already been buried. The army decorated them with medals, but most would have traded the ribbons for one more hour of peace or a drink of water that didn't taste like smoke. Major Whittlesey became a symbol of stoic heroism, the man who never surrendered. Yet inside, the silence of the Argonne never left him. Every newspaper photograph, every parade, every hand that grasped his in thanks, all of it pressed the weight of ghosts upon him. On Thanksgiving Day, 1921, he boarded the SS Toloa, leaving behind his law practice, his medals, and his note. "I can't live with it anymore," it said. He walked into the Atlantic as if to rejoin his men. In the end, the Lost Battalion wasn't just a story of bravery. It was a mirror showing the cost of endurance, the loneliness of survival, and the strange cruelty of fate that spares one man to remember what 100 others died to forget. History books call it a victory, but in the Argonne, there were no victors, only survivors. And yet, through that agony, something undeniable endured. The stubborn, irrational refusal of human beings to yield when every reason tells them to. That is what makes legends, not glory, not medals, but the will to stand in hell and still say, "We hold the line."